Hello guys. Welcome to the Whispered Ages channel. Long before the rise of ancient China, a mysterious civilization carved magnificent jade cities, then vanished without a name. This is their story. Somewhere in eastern China, buried under rice fields and lake sediment for thousands of years, there are the remains of a city. Not a village, not a settlement, a city with walls, with districts, with a water management system so sophisticated that engineers today still study it with genuine admiration. A city that existed before the Shang dynasty, before the Zhou, before any of the great dynasties that most people associate with ancient China. Here is the thing that makes this genuinely strange. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know the name of a single person who lived there. No king, no priest, no farmer, nobody. They left behind no writing, no inscriptions, no records. Just the physical evidence of a civilization so organized, so hierarchical, so clearly intentional that calling it anything less than a civilization feels like an understatement. And at the center of everything they left behind, jade. Enormous quantities of it, carved with a precision that should not have been possible, shaped into objects that carried clear symbolic meaning and appear in graves across a territory the size of a modern country. Whatever these people believed, whatever held their world together, jade was at the heart of it. Not gold, not bronze, jade. The site at the center of this story is called Liangzhu. That name comes from the modern Chinese village near where archaeologists first started digging. It is not what the people who lived there called their home, we have no idea what they called it. Liangzhu is just our label, our way of pointing at something that otherwise has no handle. The culture flourished roughly between 3300 and 2300 BCE, more than 5,000 years ago. That makes it contemporary with the early phases of ancient Egypt, roughly parallel to the Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia, and entirely independent of both. This was not a backwater, not a late arrival to the story of human civilization. This was one of the places where complex society was being invented from scratch, on its own terms. But here is where the story gets complicated in a way that makes it worth paying close attention to. Liangzhu left no text. Everything we think we know about them comes from archaeology, from what the ground preserves and what it destroys, from the shapes of objects and the patterns of how they were arranged, from soil layers, pollen samples, and the chemical signatures of ancient floods. Archaeology can tell you that a society was stratified, that some people had vastly more than others, that objects moved across long distances, that a city was planned rather than grown. But it cannot tell you what people called their gods, or whether they had a word for love, or what a mother whispered to her child. The evidence has hard edges and real limits, and being honest about those limits is part of what makes this story worth trusting. What the evidence can tell us is already astonishing. We are talking about a walled city with an inner core and outer districts, surrounded by a hydraulic infrastructure, a system of dams, channels, and reservoirs that managed water across an area of almost 1,000 square kilometers. This was not accidental, not gradual. It required planning, coordination, and labor mobilization on a scale that implies real political authority. Somebody was in charge. A great many people were taking orders, and the whole system worked reliably for somewhere around 1,000 years. Then it stopped. The city was abandoned. The culture disappeared from the archaeological record with a suddenness that raises its own questions. The jade stopped being made. The water system stopped being maintained. The people, whatever remained of them, scattered or transformed into something archaeologists classify differently. A civilization that had lasted a millennium was gone in what feels, by archaeological standards, like an eye blink. Why? That question has more than one answer depending on which researcher you ask: climate, floods, internal collapse, external pressure. All of these have been proposed, and none of them fully closes the case. But before we get to the end, we need to understand what was actually there, because the scale of what Liangzhu built, organized, and believed is the only way to make the disappearance feel as significant as it actually is. 5,000 years ago, in the waterlogged lowlands south of what is now the Yangtze River Delta, a society was building something remarkable. They had no metal tools, no writing system, no wheel. And somehow they quarried, transported, and carved jade into objects of extraordinary complexity, laid out a city on a floodplain with geometric precision, and moved enough earth to bury the evidence for millennia. Picture the landscape first. Before the cities, before the rice fields, before the thousands of years of human reshaping that turned this region into one of the most densely populated places on Earth, the lower Yangtze Basin was something close to a maze. A vast interlocking system of rivers, lakes, shallow marshes, and tidal flats spreading across the coastal plain of what is now eastern China, south of Shanghai, in the modern province of Zhejiang. The land did not have clean edges. It shifted seasonally between wet and wetter. The boundary between solid ground and open water was a negotiation, not a line. And that, counterintuitively, is exactly why people built something extraordinary here. Wetlands get dismissed. We associate them with difficulty, with insects, with terrain that resists the kind of neat organization humans prefer. But wetland environments, specifically the kind of productive mosaic you get at the junction of rivers, lakes, and deltaic plains, are among the most resource-rich places a pre-industrial society could possibly inhabit. The water itself is a transportation network, no roads required. You move people, materials, and food by boat, which is faster, cheaper in labor terms, and capable of carrying far more weight than anything dragged across land. The lakes and channels are full of fish, year-round protein that doesn't require hunting large game across open terrain. The shallow margins produce reeds in enormous quantities, building material, which means boats, baskets, roofing, tools. The higher ground between the water bodies, slightly elevated and slightly drier, is ideal for wet rice cultivation, which produces more calories per unit of land than almost any other agricultural system humans have ever devised. So the lower Yangtze was not a difficult place to survive. It was, if you understood it, an extraordinarily generous one. The people who became the Liangzhu culture understood it at a level that took centuries of accumulated knowledge to develop. But generous does not mean easy. The same hydrology that made this landscape productive also made it dangerous, in ways that required an organized response rather than an individual one. The seasonal monsoon rains here are not gentle. They deliver water in concentrated bursts, and low-lying plains do not drain quickly. Floods were not occasional disasters, they were a recurring structural feature of the environment. Predictable in the sense that they would happen, unpredictable in the sense that you could not know exactly when, how severe, or where the water would decide to go this year rather than last. Living here without some mechanism for managing that water was not really an option for a dense population. You either developed the infrastructure to control flooding, channel runoff, and store water for dry seasons, or you lived at the margins of what the landscape could support and hoped for luck. This is why geography shaped everything about Liangzhu. Transport routes followed the water. Settlements clustered on elevated ground between channels. The agricultural system was designed around flooding rather than despite it. And the political system, whatever it actually looked like at the human level, had to be capable of coordinating labor across a wide area, because the water did not respect individual plots or individual communities. Managing it was inherently a collective problem. The scale of the hydraulic works found at Liangzhu only makes sense against this background. These were not vanity projects. They were survival infrastructure, and the fact that they required massive coordinated effort tells us something real about how authority was organized. A word about what "before China" actually means here, because it's easy to misread in either of two directions. One mistake is to treat Liangzhu as somehow outside history, a curiosity that predates the real story. The other is to treat it as a straightforward ancestor of modern China, a proto-dynasty connecting in a clean line to the Shang and the Zhou and everything after. Neither framing holds up. What "before China" means in this context is before political unification, before written dynastic histories, before the administrative and cultural apparatus that eventually consolidated different regional traditions under a single recognizable identity. The China of the Shang dynasty, with its oracle bones, its bronze ritual vessels, and its recognizable writing system, does not appear until roughly 1600 BCE. Liangzhu was already gone by then. These people were not early Chinese in the way that, say, early medieval Franks were early French. They were something else entirely, operating in a world that had not yet been organized into the categories we later imposed on it. And they were not alone in that world. The late Neolithic period across East Asia, roughly 4000 to 2000 BCE, was not the story of one culture developing in isolation while everyone else waited. It was a story of multiple regional cultures evolving in parallel, sometimes in contact, sometimes genuinely independent. The Yangshao culture was developing in the Yellow River Basin to the north, producing distinctive painted pottery and millet-based agriculture. The Longshan culture emerged later, also in the north, with its own technological trajectory. In the southeast, alongside Liangzhu, the Majiabang and Himudu cultures represented earlier phases of wetland adaptation. These were not a ladder, each rung leading to the next. They were more like different experiments running simultaneously in different ecological theaters, each one solving the problem of how to build a complex society under its own local conditions. Liangzhu was one of those experiments. But by most of the metrics we use to measure complexity, it was one of the most ambitious. The scale of the city, the reach of its trade networks, the sophistication of its water management, and the sheer volume and precision of its jade production put it in a category that demands serious attention, not because it was Chinese before China existed, but because it was something human beings built somewhere on this planet 5,000 years ago, and then the ground swallowed it so completely that we are only now beginning to understand what was actually there. Liangzhu did not arrive in textbooks as a finished idea. It crept into view one trench, one mound of soil at a time, and for a while almost nobody realized what they were actually looking at. In the early 20th century, the lower Yangtze wetlands were still mostly being read as background, not as text. Farmers pulled up odd things in their fields now and then: potsherds, polished stone tools, the occasional mysterious piece of carved green stone. Local collectors bought some of it. Some went into curiosity cabinets in the cities. But without a framework, without a pattern, these were just old things. Interesting, maybe, but not yet evidence of a vanished city-scale civilization. The turning point came in the 1930s, when archaeologists began paying systematic attention to Neolithic sites in the region. At a village called Liangzhu, on a low rise near the wetlands, surveys and small excavations turned up burials and artifacts that clearly weren't from any known historical dynasty. The pottery was thick and gray, not the painted wares familiar from Yangshao in the north. The stone tools were finely ground and polished. And there were strange, heavy jade pieces, discs, tubes, that didn't quite fit the patterns known from later Chinese ritual bronzes, but felt oddly like their ancestors. Still, with only a few graves and scattered material, early researchers classified Liangzhu as one more local Neolithic culture layer among many. Important, yes, but nobody was yet talking about large-scale hydraulic systems, urban planning, or an entire wetland civilization. The data didn't justify it yet. It helps here to understand how archaeologists decide a culture exists in the first place. It isn't a label applied just because a site is interesting, it's a pattern recognition problem. They look at pottery first, because pottery is everywhere and it breaks in ways that preserve evidence. Clay recipes, firing techniques, surface treatments, and shapes form a kind of fingerprint. If the same kinds of jars, bowls, and tripods, made in the same way, show up over and over across different sites, you're probably looking at people who learned from each other or traded with each other. Then burial patterns. Are the dead laid out the same way? Are there grave goods? Do some graves have far more and finer objects than others? Consistent habits around death are a strong marker of shared belief. Tools matter too, the exact shapes of axes, adzes, and knives, the way blades are hafted, the use of jade versus common stone, all speak to a shared technological tradition. Finally, settlement layouts. Where houses sit relative to each other, whether there are defensive ditches or walls, platforms, central spaces, zones that might have been reserved for elites or rituals. When pottery, burials, tools, and settlement forms all cluster together in a consistent package across multiple locations, archaeologists start using a cultural name as shorthand. Liangzhu becomes not just a village, but a cultural horizon. The big shift came in the second half of the 20th century and accelerated in recent decades. More systematic surveys and rescue excavations, prompted by dams, roads, and urban expansion, turned up site after site across the lower Yangtze. The same gray-black pottery, the same style of polished stone and jade tools, the same disc and tube forms in burials, and increasingly the same kind of settlement positioning. Slightly raised ground near ancient river channels and marsh edges. What looked like a local phenomenon began to resolve into an entire network. Dozens, then hundreds of sites shared that Liangzhu signature. Some were small hamlets, some were cemeteries. A few, As excavations scaled up, revealed something else, planned layouts, encircling earthworks, and, around what we now call the Liangzhu core area, evidence of enormous hydraulic constructions. That's when interpretation started changing. This was not just a Neolithic culture in the narrow sense. This was a complex system that, by many definitions, crosses the line into early civilization. But to say any of that with confidence, you have to know when it happened, and dating is where archaeology shifts from pattern spotting to chronology building, rarely as simple as documentaries make it sound. The first layer of dating is relative. You build a stratigraphy, noting what lies above what. If a burial cuts through a house floor, the burial is younger. If flood sediments bury a settlement, the flood came later than the occupation. Compare these sequences across sites, and certain pottery styles consistently appear below others, letting you assemble a relative timeline of phases. Then come absolute dates. Organic remains, charcoal from hearths, burned rice grains from storage pits, wooden stakes from dikes, can be radiocarbon dated. The decay of carbon-14 gives a date range in years before present, calibrated against known fluctuations in atmospheric carbon. No single radiocarbon date is perfect, each comes with error bars. So archaeologists collect many from multiple layers and multiple sites and look for coherent clusters. This is where Liangzhu's story sharpens. Radiocarbon dates from settlement layers, from rice paddies, from the great earthen dams and channels, all converge on a window roughly between 3300 and 2300 BCE. Cross-checks with other regional sequences, early and late Hemudu, Majayabang, and later cultures like Kujiling or Longshan further north, help anchor Liangzhu within the broader Neolithic puzzle of East Asia. The timelines line up in a way that suggests Liangzhu is late Neolithic, flourishing roughly 1,000 years before the earliest accepted Shang state in the north. But there's a missing piece that shapes how confidently anyone can claim to know what was actually going on, writing, or rather the lack of it. In later Chinese history, you can read oracle bone inscriptions that name who made a sacrifice and what question they asked. You can identify kings by name, administrative offices, legal proclamations. At Liangzhu, nothing like that has shown up. No undisputed writing system, no royal names, no records of battles, taxes, edicts, or myths. That absence forces a different kind of caution. We can call the central site a city based on its scale, planning, and function, but we cannot read what its inhabitants called it. We infer hierarchy from burial wealth and architecture, but we cannot know whether authority rested in a hereditary king, a council of lineages, a network of ritual specialists, or some mixture. We see vast waterworks and can reasonably speak of organized labor, but we have no administrative tablets spelling out quotas. This gap created plenty of room for early misinterpretation. At first, some scholars saw Liangzhu jade simply as luxury objects from later, historically attested dynasties that had somehow migrated down into the ground by chance. Others slotted Liangzhu into a tidy teleology. A straightforward ancestor of Shang civilization, as if there were a direct, unbroken line from these wetland jade carvers to the bronze casters of the Yellow River. It is tempting, when you want a clean story of Chinese civilization, to assign Liangzhu the role of proto-everything. As more sites appeared and the dating tightened, those simple stories started to crack. The geographic center of Liangzhu is not the Yellow River but the lower Yangtze wetlands. Its economy is built around rice, not millet. Its monumental investments are water control earthworks, not walled palace temple complexes in a dry valley. Its jade repertoire is distinct, and while later dynasties clearly revered and reused some of these forms, the relationship looks more like cultural borrowing across time than a single unbroken lineage. Interpretations evolved. Liangzhu began to be seen as one of several high-complexity regional civilizations in late Neolithic East Asia, interacting in ways we are still piecing together. Its jade might have traveled far beyond the wetlands, its ideas even farther. But the story we can tell about it remains bounded by what the ground has chosen to preserve: potsherds, post holes, rice husks, tombs, tools, and earthworks, but no written voice. The discovery of Liangzhu, then, is not a single moment. It is a slow accumulation of clues, the same pottery turning up again and again, the same burial patterns repeating across the landscape, the same radiocarbon ranges clustering, until suddenly a picture snaps into focus. There was a city here, and more than a city, a whole system coherent enough to leave a fingerprint from one side of the delta to the other. If your landscape is mud, channels, and seasonal floods, how do you even have a city? At Liangzhu, the answer seems to be, you build one. When archaeologists talk about the Liangzhu core, they aren't pointing to a vague cluster of huts. They mean a deliberately bounded, carefully arranged space that sprawled over several square kilometers, set on slightly higher ground and wrapped in massive earthen walls. Not just one wall either, layers of enclosure. An inner platformed area with especially dense architecture, outer residential zones, and beyond that, the broader mosaic of fields, paddies, and satellite hamlets. The main wall alone is staggering, tens of meters wide at the base, several kilometers in circumference, composed of piled earth packed in layers. It wasn't a random pile of dirt thrown up in a panic. Sections show consistent construction techniques suggesting teams working from shared templates. Inside that perimeter, the ground itself was reshaped, leveled here, raised there into platforms that lifted key buildings above the dam. What emerges from the excavation plans is not chaos but zoning. On some platforms, dense clusters of post holes marked the footprints of large timber buildings that likely served administrative or ritual functions. Nearby, but distinct, are residential areas with smaller, repeated house forms. Rectangular ground plans, similarly oriented, arranged along what look like lanes. In other zones, the density of hearths, slag, debris, and specialized tools spikes, hinting at craft workshops. Elsewhere, pits and jars cluster together, the signature of storage. It's not a grid like later imperial cities, but it's also not just houses dropped wherever there was a dry patch. Certain activities are concentrated and separated from others. There is an inside and an outside. There are thresholds. This is where the argument for planning gets teeth. A big village can grow up organically, even a defensive ditch might be deepened a little more each year by loosely coordinated neighbors. But Liangzhu's central site looks different. The scale is beyond what a few households, or even a single lineage, could manage in their spare time. To throw up monumental walls and platforms in a wetland environment, you need to survey alignments, coordinate the movement of enormous volumes of earth, and ensure foundations won't simply slump back into the muck. You need to synchronize labor so embankments connect, channels meet, and platforms reach the same elevation. The repeated house forms and standardized orientations. Doorways facing similar directions, structures built on parallel axes, storage pits cut in specific zones rather than scattered randomly, look less like individual improvisation and more like a shared plan unfolding. Tying it all together is the broader engineered landscape. Canals, ditches, and ponds lace through and around the city zone. Some clearly functioned as drainage, keeping residential platforms dry. Others look navigable, at least by small boats. Daily movement would have run not only along packed earth paths but by water, people pulled from outlying hamlets into the central area, cutting across fields and marshes, docking at the edges of the walled zone. Within the city, that watery infrastructure doubled as a circulation system, goods, people, perhaps ritual processions moving along prescribed routes in and out of gates and districts. Superimpose the canals, the walls, the platforms, and the house clusters, and it stops looking like accidental sprawl and starts looking like a designed organism. This is urbanism without stone, without writing, and without the kind of palace ruins that grab headlines. Its monumentality is horizontal, sunk into earthworks and soil chemistry rather than standing up in photogenic ruins. We can't point to a tablet announcing that in the reign of such and such lord, the eastern wall was built using 10,000 workers. But the construction itself is the inscription. The earth is the record. Coordinated labor over years or decades implies some entity with the authority to mobilize people and resources. To feed workers, schedule tasks around agricultural cycles, allocate land plots inside the walls. That could be a king, a council of elders, temple managers, or powerful clans. Archaeology can't yet say which. But the coordination itself is very hard to deny once you look at the scale and coherence of Liangzhu's core. Daily life inside this planned wetland city would have been shaped by these choices in ways that show up in patterns rather than dramatic artifacts. Families lived in houses raised on platforms or stilts, navigated narrow lanes that turned muddy in the rains but drained into nearby ditches, lived with the constant presence of water at the edges of their neighborhoods. Children grew up threading paths between craft areas where jade was being ground, pottery fired, tools polished. Workers walked routine routes from home to field, from field to storage, from storage to distribution points closer to the inner zone. Rice from the paddies came in by boat or by shoulder load, passed into storage pits or granaries near the city, then redistributed, a flow of grain, tools, and prestige goods across a space with distinct production, storage, and elite zones, exactly the pattern that in other regions defines an urban center. Was Liangzhu a city in the full sense of the word? Here scholars part ways. If city means a dense settlement with tens of thousands of people, clear administrative hierarchies, full-time craft specialists, and formal public spaces, the Liangzhu core checks quite a few boxes. Population estimates are always shaky, but the scale of the enclosed area suggests at least several thousand inhabitants in and around the main center, plus a surrounding halo of smaller communities plugged into its orbit. If city requires written bureaucracy, standardized coinage, and monumental stone architecture, Liangzhu falls short. It's late Neolithic, not Bronze Age. Its tools are stone and jade. Its monuments are earth and water. Its records, if they existed at all, were probably perishable. Some researchers prefer softer terms: large central settlement, regional center, proto-urban complex. Others argue that clinging to those labels just smuggles in a bias toward later, drier, brick and stone civilizations. What most agree on is that whatever label you choose, this wasn't just a big village that happened to sit by a river. The walls, platforms, canals, and patterned neighborhoods say something new had crystallized in the lower Yangtze, an experiment in building dense, organized life on unstable ground. And at the heart of that experiment lay a deeper gamble. That people could not only live with water, but command it. Step outside the city walls, and the scale of Liangzhu's ambition jumps again. The earthworks don't stop at the city edge. They expand into an outer ring of dams, levees, and reservoirs that, taken together, look less like a village's flood defenses and more like a regional hydraulic system. Northwest of the core, archaeologists have mapped a series of massive embankments now known as the Tongshan and Ganggong systems. On the ground they are long, low ridges. On survey maps they resolve into sweeping arcs and straight segments that link hills, cut across low-lying valleys, and stand at elevations that would have allowed them to hold back water. Some of these dams are hundreds of meters long, several meters high, with bases wide enough to have taken thousands of cubic meters of earth. Their alignments track topographic contours, closing natural gaps between higher ground and creating enclosed basins where rainwater and river overflow could be captured. Between the major embankments, smaller dikes and levees lace the landscape, a low ridge splitting a valley to divert flow, a raised causeway doubling as both road and water barrier. The picture that emerges is of a wetland compartmentalized into a chain of managed pools, channels, and storage areas. This is where water control equals power stops being metaphorical. In a monsoon-fed land, the difference between prosperity and catastrophe is timing and volume. Too much water at the wrong moment and paddies wash out, too little and seedlings fail. If you can flatten that curve, shave the peak off floods, hold back water to release later, you can stabilize harvests. The Liangzhu system appears built to do exactly that. High outer dams catching the first surge of floodwater and slowing it, broad reservoirs behind them storing the excess, controlled outlets, now eroded, but inferred from gaps and channels, bleeding water gradually into lower-lying paddies and canals around the central settlement. Think through what that means for power. If you live downstream of that dam, your livelihood depends on decisions made upriver. When to open a gate, when to reinforce a weak spot, whose fields get priority water in a dry year. Control the water, and you don't just protect fields, you become the arbiter of risk. To build such a system, someone has to do more than panic dig when the river rises. You need surveyors who can read subtle gradients across a landscape that, to the untrained, looks flat. You need people who can walk kilometers with simple tools and mark out lines that will actually hold water where you want it, tying those lines into existing streams. The embankments at Liangzhu show exactly that kind of foresight. Their tops sit within narrow elevation bands, and in places separate dikes built from different directions meet at clean joins, meaning teams were working to a shared plan, not improvising as they went. That's surveying. Then there is maintenance. Earth doesn't stay put in a floodplain out of respect for engineering. It slumps, erodes, cracks. Rodents burrow, plants root, water looks for weak spots. An embankment that isn't constantly inspected and patched will fail, maybe not this year, but soon. Picture the social machinery behind those long, silent ridges, seasonal work parties trudging along the tops of dikes, tamping fresh earth into depressions, pulling saplings before their roots destabilize the slope. Teams dredging feeder canals choked with silt after the rains, supervisors, call them chiefs, foremen, or ritual officials, allocating whose labor goes where, whose village is responsible for which stretch. This is infrastructure that only makes sense if it persists across generations. If your dam takes 10 years to complete and your children will be the ones benefiting from its protection, you are, by definition, planning in centuries, not seasons. The payoff, if it worked, was enormous. More predictable water means more reliable rice. More reliable rice means more people can be supported per square kilometer. Once harvests are less whiplashed by flood and drought, a society can dare to specialize. In a small, unstable farming community, almost everyone has to hedge, farm, fish, make their own tools, patch their own clothes, because one bad year could wipe out surplus and leave no room for passengers. In a landscape where waterworks smooth out the worst shocks, you can afford full-time jade carvers, potters, woodworkers, people who spend most of their days doing something other than coaxing grain out of the mud. Liangzhu's artifact record lines up with that expectation: high volumes of finely worked jade, standardized tools, elaborate ritual items, all implying artisans with regular access to food they did not produce themselves. The waterworks weren't just protecting fields. They were underwriting craft, ceremony, and the social complexity that comes with them. What exactly were these dams and reservoirs for? Interpretations diverge. One camp emphasizes flood control, pointing to the placement of major embankments near river inlets and vulnerable lowlands, and arguing that their primary purpose was to shield the core settlement and surrounding paddies from catastrophic inundation, reservoirs as safety valves, places to park excess water when rivers ran too high. Another camp leans toward irrigation, noting that some dikes sit not at the flood front but along lines that would spread water evenly over a wide area, paired with canals leading into cultivated zones, structures that could have stored monsoon water and released it during dry spells, keeping paddies wet when the skies turn stingy. Then there's transportation. Many of the channels tied into this system are straight, relatively uniform in width, and link different parts of the basin in ways that make more sense for moving goods than for purely hydraulic efficiency. Some reservoirs may have doubled as harbor basins, where boats could load and unload grain, timber, or jade. In practice, these functions aren't mutually exclusive. An embankment that keeps floodwater out of your houses can also serve as a raised roadway between settlements. A reservoir that moderates peak flows can also be tapped during drought and used as a boat landing. A canal that diverts water toward paddies can also carry cargo between workshops and storage pits. The more researchers map, the more Liangzhu's system looks like an integrated, multi-purpose water landscape rather than a single-function project, less a dam here, a canal there, and more a designed hydrological envelope around the city. What all sides agree on is that this envelope changed the rules of life in the lower Yangtze. Instead of surrendering to a wetlands moods, Liangzhu communities tried to regiment them. They wrapped their fields and homes in engineered contours, turned flood pulses into stored capital, and built social hierarchies around the ability to command large groups for construction and upkeep. Water became not just a background condition but the medium through which authority, labor, and surplus were organized. Rice, especially wet rice, is not just plant, water, harvest. It's a choreography between plant, water, soil, and human attention, and in a place like the lower Yangtze it's the difference between a scattered wetland hamlet and a city that can afford to stack jade in tombs. The basic logic of wet rice agriculture is deceptively simple. Take a low-lying field and surround it with small earthen bunds, miniature dikes that hold water in. Level the surface so there are no dry patches or deep puddles. Flood it shallowly, not so deep that the plants drown, but enough to blanket the soil. Rice, unlike most other grains, thrives there. Its stems can grow through standing water, many of its weeds and pests cannot. The water layer moderates temperature swings, slows disease, and lets you pack a lot of plants into a small area. Compared to dryland cereals, a well-run paddy system can produce more calories per hectare, year after year. That's why, when you look at some of the densest pre-modern populations on Earth, you keep finding rice at the base of the pyramid. Liangzhu sits right where that story was being written. Long before monumental dams, people in this region were experimenting with rice along natural floodplains and back swamps. By the time Liangzhu culture emerges, the botanical remains shift from occasional, probably wild, cultivation towards something systematic, managed, and increasingly domesticated. Grains become more uniform, hulls show traits associated with human selection, the contexts they appear in, pits, burned concentrations, fields with patterned microtopography, line up with deliberate cultivation. Pair that with the water control already described. The big outer dams and levees create the frame. Inside it, the landscape can be subdivided into paddies, stepped down in elevation, each receiving water from the one above and passing it to the one below. With sluices, gaps in the bunds, and small channels, farmers could fine-tune depth and timing, spreading a hard monsoon surge through the system by letting upper paddies take the hit before passing water downstream as needed, or opening gates from reservoirs to push water into lower fields when the rain sputtered and stopped. Archaeologists reconstructing this don't get aerial footage. They get soil. Thin layers of silted clay with iron mottling and root traces that match waterlogged conditions, pollen spectra showing spikes in rice relative to wild wetland plants, patterns of small ridges and depressions still faintly visible under later deposits. Together these sketch a wetland turned into a kind of terraced sponge, holding, moving, and draining water in service of one crop above all. Rice wasn't alone in this system. Living in a marshscape means not ignoring the fish, snails, and crustaceans that practically throw themselves at you in flood season. Liangzhu sites are rich in aquatic remains, fish bones, turtle shells, freshwater shellfish, some drilled and turned into ornaments, many showing signs of having been processed for food. The edges of paddies and canals doubled as foraging zones. Flooded fields attract fish that come in to feed or spawn, trappable in small nets or enclosures as water levels change. Around the slightly higher ground, levee tops, natural mounds, the raised city core, there's evidence for fruits and nuts, acorns, water chestnuts, possibly peach, either gathered wild or lightly managed. On drier patches, people hunted deer, wild boar, and smaller mammals, with bone assemblages showing the cut marks and burning of butchery and cooking. As for animals under human control, the picture is more complicated. Pig bones show up in abundance at many Liangzhu culture sites, often in domestic contexts. Their age profiles and morphology suggest at least some level of domestication or very intensive management of wild populations. Dogs are present too, almost obligatory in Neolithic East Asia, serving as hunting aids, camp guards, and occasionally food. Together this creates a diversified food web wrapped around a rice core. Rice paddies pump out starch. Fish, turtles, and shellfish add protein and fat, especially in the hungry gap between planting and harvest. Pigs turn kitchen scraps and byproducts into meat. Nuts and gathered plants buffer bad years. The whole system is tuned to the seasonal heartbeat of the monsoon, but spread out enough that a failure in one part doesn't automatically spell famine. That diversity is exactly what you need to attempt something radical in prehistoric terms. Freeing a chunk of your population from food production. Surplus, to transform a society, has to be dependable enough that people can count on it, build plans on it, stake their lives on it. The waterworks gave Liangzhu a fighting chance at that. Smoothing out the worst spikes of flood and drought lets a society start thinking in multi-year cycles. Granaries, likely built in wood that has since rotted away but inferred from storage pits and post patterns, would have let grain be carried across seasons. Pottery vessels large enough to hold serious quantities of rice turn up in domestic and ritual contexts. With stable calories flowing in, people could spend their days chipping jade, casting and polishing stone tools, weaving textiles, coordinating labor, or performing rituals rather than weeding paddies. Those jade discs and tubes don't appear out of thin air, they are the product of thousands of hours of grinding, drilling, and polishing by specialists who needed to eat every single day while producing objects that, from a strictly survivalist perspective, do nothing. But there's a catch. The very thing that makes wetlands so generous, their sensitivity to water, also makes them treacherous. Rice loves consistent shallow flooding, hates prolonged deep submergence at the wrong growth stage, and suffers if paddies dry out just as seedlings are establishing. One late-season storm that dumps too much water can rot grain in the field. A levee breach upstream at the wrong moment can scour an entire field, leaving bare, nutrient-poor subsoil. A year when monsoon rains simply don't come on schedule forces hard choices about which plots get the last trickle from the reservoir and which are written off. Liangzhu's elaborate hydraulic shell was an attempt to shift those odds, but it couldn't remove risk, it just concentrated management. If your food comes mainly from a wild landscape, a bad flood might move the fish around and drown some plants, but the ecosystem as a whole absorbs the shock. When your calories are locked into grids of paddies, a failure in the water system can be all or nothing. There were social trade-offs too. Fields sitting higher on the water ladder, literally upstream, had structural advantages, first access to water released from reservoirs, and greater safety from deep floods if the levees held. Those were the fields worth controlling. For an emerging elite, access to water, and to the surplus it created, became a lever for hierarchy. Households that could count on irrigation in a dry year were better able to invest in long-term projects, nicer houses, better tools, offerings for ancestors, patronage of artisans. Households at the margins, low-lying and last in line, lived closer to the edge even in good years. And when the whole system was this finely tuned, storms and floods became tests of the social order. If embankments failed, people would ask who was responsible for maintenance, and why one village got rescue labor while another didn't. If certain paddies stayed green through a dry spell because they had priority access to reservoir outlets, everyone could see who had pull and who didn't. For a while, though, Liangzhu seemed to keep the balance. They turned swamp into surplus, and surplus into jade, ritual, and rank. Jade is a nightmare material. Most of the Liangzhu pieces we call jade are actually nephrite, a tough, fibrous mineral that ranks high on hardness scales and even higher on how much time it will waste. You don't flake nephrite the way you do flint, strike it and it tends to bruise, not break cleanly. Its internal structure is more like a mass of tangled fibers than brittle glass. That's exactly why later cultures loved it for axes and blades. It doesn't shatter easily, resists wear, and is harder than most things you'd ever want to cut. Those same properties make it brutal to shape. To turn a raw jade cobble into a smooth, symmetrical disc or a squared tube with a round hole, you can't rely on impact, you have to abrade it away, grain by grain. Imagine a Jade Workers' day. You start with a roughly shaped blank, its most awkward corners already knocked off with harder stone hammers. The real work is still ahead. You brace the piece and start rubbing it against a harder surface with abrasive grit, sand rich in quartz, crushed harder stones, specially selected powders. Hours go by, then days. For the largest pieces, probably weeks. To drill a hole, you don't punch through with a metal bit, you twist a hollow tube of bone, wood, or softer stone, feeding an abrasive slurry at the contact point. The tube itself doesn't cut much, the suspended grit does. It's liquid sandpaper powered by your wrists. As the slurry grinds, a cylindrical core slowly emerges from the other side. You clear it, freshen the abrasive, keep turning, over and over. Polishing is its own ordeal, stepping down to finer and finer abrasives, working every surface until it reflects light smoothly. The high gloss on many Liangzhu pieces is the accumulated product of thousands of repetitive strokes performed by people who knew exactly how much pressure, how much grit, and how much patience each stage demanded. None of this happens in a vacuum. Jade workshops need steady access to abrasives, organized collection of sand and stone powders, sorted by grain size, perhaps even by mineral composition. They need water, to make slurry, to cool surfaces, to wash away residue, likely meaning work close to canals or wells. They need tools, drill tubes, cords for bow drills, grinding slabs, supports, containers for different grades of abrasive. They need space, dry and stable, where pieces can sit for long periods without being lost or damaged. And critically, they need time. A farmer missing a day of weeding sees the results quickly. A jade worker missing a day just delays a necklace or a ritual tube that will never touch a tree. If someone is free to sit for hours grinding stone, the rice fields must be producing enough, regularly enough, that the community can support them. When archaeologists excavate Liangzhu sites, they sometimes find concentrations of jade chips, partly finished pieces, broken drills, and piles of abrasive debris, the scars of production. Jade was not something made casually at home during a slack season. It was an industry, and industry means networks. Nephrite doesn't come from the Paddybank mud. The best-known sources in eastern China lie in mountain belts hundreds of kilometers from the Liangzhu core. Petrographic and geochemical analyses suggest at least some of the jade used at Liangzhu came from specific upland zones to the southwest and west. That implies several things at once. First, someone had to know where those stones were, knowledge built over generations of foraging, prospecting, and testing. Second, raw boulders or preformed blanks had to travel down river valleys, along overland paths, perhaps in dugout canoes or carried in baskets. The farther the stone traveled, the more hands were involved, local extractors, middlemen, transporters, the people feeding and housing them en route. By the time a jade cobble reached a workshop in Liangzhu, it may have passed through many communities. That flow of stone was also a flow of information and obligation, who owed jade to whom, whose prestige depended on controlling access to distant quarries, which families or lineages had the right to sponsor particular artisans. Finished objects traveled too. Liangzhu-style jades, especially characteristic forms like flat discs and squared tubes, turn up far beyond the city itself, at sites scattered across the lower Yangtze region and beyond. Some are high quality, clearly made by skilled specialists, others look like local imitations, copying the style with less skill or inferior stone. Every one of those pieces is a data point. When the stone matches sources near the core, it suggests finished goods moving as diplomatic gifts, trade items, or status symbols. When the stone is local but the shape is Liangzhu style, it suggests ideas were moving even when rocks were not. Jade, in that sense, is a map of connections you can hold in your hand. It's also a window into specialization. You don't wake up one day and intuit how to drill a perfect concentric hole through a thick ring without cracking it. You learn from someone, who learned from someone before them. On some Liangzhu pieces you can trace sequences of work, how a surface was first rough ground, then trued up along certain angles, then polished, how drill holes align or fail to align. These are like fingerprints of workshop traditions, different clusters of objects showing slightly different habits, the angle of certain bevels, the finishing of edges, hinting at individual schools or lineages of jade workers. Teaching those skills takes time. A novice might start on waste pieces or simple beads, learning how much pressure is too much, how to read the sound and feel of stone under drill or grinder. Over years they graduate to more complex forms. At the top, a small number of master specialists are trusted with the largest, most symbolically loaded items. For such a system to persist, you need continuity, stable food supplies, political backing, and cultural value strong enough that children can afford to spend their youth apprenticed to stone rather than to the hoe. Jade production was not just an economic activity but a social institution, embedded in families, lineages, perhaps tied to particular ritual obligations. Not all jade objects served the same role. Some were unapologetically functional, axes and adzes with polished blades and were patterns suggesting real use, cutting and chopping wood, nephrite's toughness making it genuinely good for this, even as such tools might double as status markers. Others barely pretended to be useful, oversized axes too thin to risk on a log, discs with no cutting edge at all, tubes that would make terrible containers but perfect offerings. Many of these show little or no wear from everyday handling. Instead they cluster in tombs, caches, or ritual pits. Their function is meaning. They operate as symbols of rank, of connection to ancestors or spirits, of participation in a shared cosmology. Owning them, displaying them, burying them with the dead were all ways of broadcasting position in a social order that was increasingly stratified. In that sense, jade at Liangzhu is not just treasure. It's a technology of power and memory. It encodes labor in its surfaces, every polished stroke a calorie burned by someone whose rice came from somewhere else. It encodes networks in its material, each piece a chunk of mountain carried across long distances. And it encodes learning in its forms, generations of trial and error refined into standard designs that meant something to the people who saw them. Lined up, these discs and tubes are not just pretty stones. They are a system that turns surplus grain, river routes, mountain quarries, and human hands into solidified hierarchy. And the shapes themselves, the circles, the squares, the carved faces, hint that this wasn't random decoration. They were carving a worldview into the hardest material they could reliably work. A bai is, stripped of meaning, just a flat disk of jade with a hole in the center. But Liangzhu bai are not washers. They are large, carefully standardized circles, sometimes as broad as a person's torso, often polished to a soft, almost liquid shine. Their edges are even, their central holes hit similar proportions from piece to piece. Some are razor thin, improbably delicate for stone, others are thick, a kind of jade donut you'd hesitate to pick up with one hand. Song are the other signature shape. Imagine a cylinder drilled through end to end, then squared on the outside, round inside, square outside. Stack several together and you have a column of alternating circles and squares. Liangzhu Song range from finger length to nearly the height of a child, with walls so thin that light can pass through polished edges. Both forms existed elsewhere in Neolithic China, but at Liangzhu they were made, crucially, as more than personal ornaments. In Liangzhu cemeteries, bai and song cluster in high-status burials, sometimes dozens arranged around the body, stacked in careful groups. Poorer graves, if they have jade at all, might hold a single small piece, or none. Chinese texts written 2,000 years after Liangzhu vanished spin a tidy story: discs belong to the heavens, tubes to the earth. Circles are celestial, squares terrestrial. Bai are for offerings to the sky, song for offerings to the soil and the spirits below. It is tempting to read this straight back onto Liangzhu and declare it the earliest heaven and earth cosmology carved in stone. Many scholars do see continuity. Others warn that this neat mapping might be a retroactive myth that later Zhou and Han elites projected onto older shapes they were trying to inherit. Archaeology doesn't give instruction manuals. It gives patterns, and the patterns are striking. Song, with their square exteriors and round cores, are often elaborately decorated, especially on the corners, with recurring motifs, paired eyes, a kind of fanged mouth, curling brows or horns, sometimes stacked in tiers. The lines are geometric, almost abstract, but across enough pieces of visual grammar emerges. Many researchers interpret these as stylized masks, part human, part animal, part something else. Comparing them to the later Taotai monster masks on Shang bronzes, with centrally placed eyes flanked by horns and jaws implied rather than fully shown. Others think they might represent specific spirit beings, clan emblems, or mythic ancestors. Animal forms appear too, bird-like profiles with hooked beaks and crests, coiled forms that might be snakes, dragons, or inventive scrolls, sometimes almost lost inside abstraction, just a repeating curve suggesting movement or scales or wind. By decoration is usually more restrained, many surfaces left plain, as if the pure circle and gloss were enough. When carved, bands of fine lines, dots, or simplified versions of the mask-like pattern seen on tsong frame the central whole. Taken together, these shapes and motifs look less like random aesthetic choice and more like a shared visual language, repeated across multiple Liangzhu sites and decades of occupation. The same basic recipe recurs: square outside, round inside, corner faces, tiered bands, similar eyes, similar ratios between the width of a tsong and the diameter of its inner tube, with consistent thicknesses and hole sizes for particular size classes. Different workshops, different artisans, different villages, same grammar. That tells us, first, that whatever these things meant, their makers agreed on rules, not just, make it pretty, but, make it like this, because that is what counts as a real bai, a proper tsong. Second, the rules traveled. Liangzhu-style jades show up far from the core city, in satellite settlements and other communities around the lower Yangtze, even in regions that weren't fully part of the Liangzhu political heartland, sometimes in imported stone, sometimes in local material carved into Liangzhu forms, sometimes as awkward copies where the shape is right but the carving hesitant. That spread looks a lot like shared belief moving along with goods. In a society with no surviving writing, symbolism is not decoration, it is communication. If you can't wear your rank as inscribed characters, you wear it as objects whose forms everyone recognizes. A wide, flawless bai says its owner had access to master artisans, high-quality stone, and, more importantly, the right to deploy cosmologically charged items. Tsong, especially those dense with mask motifs, may have worked like portable pillars linking the living community to a layered, invisible order of ancestors, spirits, and the structure of sky and earth. Stack them by a body, arrange them in rows, and you're building a miniature cosmic architecture out of jade. This is where cosmology and politics blur. If people believe the world has an underlying order, that sky and earth are complementary, that powerful beings inhabit the boundaries between domains, that cycles of rain, fertility, and death depend on keeping those relationships in balance, then someone who can manage those relationships holds immense leverage. Control over bai and tsong is one way to materialize that claim. Excavations show a steep gradient. A few tombs awash in jade, many with modest sets, vast numbers with none at all. The symbolism becomes self-reinforcing. The more jade you control, the more ceremonies you can host. The more ceremonies you host, the more you look like the person who keeps the world running properly, rice growing, floods timed, ancestors appeased. The more people believe that, the more willing they are to send grain, labor, and loyalty, allowing you to commission still more jade. And because the beliefs are encoded in standardized, repeatable forms, they could extend far beyond any single village. A community that shared the same basic reading of circles and squares, masks and animals, could recognize authority at a glance, even without sharing daily life. That's the core reason bai and tsong matter so much for understanding Liangzhu. They are not just luxury objects. They are evidence that this was a culture thinking in large, abstract terms about the structure of the world, about invisible forces, about how human authority plugs into those forces. When a tomb frames its dead with circles and squares, stacked tubes and encircling discs, we are looking at more than wealth. We are seeing a claim carved in stone that this person, this lineage, this community, sat at a meaningful node in the cosmos. Without texts, we can't translate the full sentence. But the grammar is there, in the consistency, the motifs, and in where the jade appears and where it doesn't. Lay out all the Liangzhu burials on a table, and you don't see a flat community. At one end are graves that are little more than shallow pits, a body, maybe a few pottery vessels, sometimes a stone tool or two. Jade, if it appears at all, is a single small piece, a bead, a thin ring, a modest undecorated pendant. At the other end are tombs like a wall. Large rectangular pits carefully cut into the ground, wood-lined chambers, multiple compartments, coffins surrounded by arranged offerings, and jade, not a piece here or there, but caches, piles, dozens of bai and song stacked, nested, propped at the head, boxed at the feet. In a few cases, more than 300 jade objects were buried with a single individual. This isn't a gentle curve from poor to rich. It's a staircase with a missing middle. Some people in Liangzhu died wrapped in a world of stone that other people would never touch, not once in their entire lives. Take Yaoshan, one of the key Liangzhu cemeteries. At the top of its burial mound lies a tomb often identified as N12. It isn't gigantic by Egyptian or Mayan standards, but in Neolithic China it is a statement. The coffin area is lined, the layout is deliberate. The individual inside, probably male based on the surviving bones, is accompanied by a flood of jade. Bai, tsong, bracelets, pendants, ceremonial axes. Below that top tomb, on lower terraces of the same mound, other burials also have jade, sometimes quite a lot, but never as much, never as fine. Go further out to smaller cemeteries around the city, and the jade thins. Go out again to rural villages contemporaneous with Liangzhu, and many graves have none at all. One mound, one apex grave, descending tiers of access to the same symbolic kit. It looks less like random variation and more like a social diagram built into the landscape. What does it take to put 300 pieces of finely worked jade into the ground and walk away? Start with the raw material. High-quality nephrite doesn't come from the wetlands around Liangzhu, it comes from distant mountains, possibly more than 1,000 kilometers away, meaning someone had to organize expeditions or long-distance trade, or both, to keep it flowing. Then factor in labor. Shaping, drilling, smoothing, and polishing hard jade with Neolithic tools takes an absurd amount of time, hundreds or thousands of hours per large piece. Multiply that by the contents of a rich tomb, and you're looking at entire lifetimes of specialized work embodied in one burial. If a single grave can absorb that much jade and labor, and the living still shrug and call it appropriate, that tells us something simple and stark. The people at the top of Liangzhu society had a level of control over resources, and over other people's time, that most of their contemporaries did not. Archaeologists imagine a few broad ways this might have worked. One is a classic chiefdom, a paramount leader, or a small cluster of elite families, sitting at the center of a web of obligations, coordinating irrigation, defending the settlement, hosting the big rituals, and receiving grain, labor, and service in return, recycling some of that surplus back out in feasts and gifts to cement loyalty. The jades and the big tombs could be the frozen residue of that system. Each by not just a pretty object but a token of past alliances, tribute from subordinate lineages, or the material proof of favors owed and returned. Another model emphasizes religious specialists, a priestly stratum rather than a single secular king. In this view, what sets the top tombs apart is not just wealth but ritual authority. The people buried there might have performed the central ceremonies that kept heaven and earth in balance, interpreted omens, managed the calendar, decided when to flood the fields and when to hold them back. If Bai and Song are the key tools of that cosmology, restricting their production and use becomes a way of monopolizing contact with the powers that matter. A third scenario imagines a coalition of several influential lineages, each anchoring part of the city with its own mound and its own jade-rich tombs, cooperating against outside threats while competing quietly in grandeur and generosity, marrying into each other's families to manage tension. In that case, the densest jade burials might mark moments when one lineage briefly gained the upper hand, or when rival leaders tried to outdo each other in death as much as in life. These are models, not certainties. The bones don't come with job titles. But however you slice it, the inequality was real, and it had to be maintained. Belief is one way. If most people genuinely thought the cosmos only ran properly when a particular lineage deployed a particular set of jades in the right sequence at the right times, handing over grain and labor would have felt less like exploitation and more like insurance. Redistribution is another. Large feasts, public rituals, seasonal gatherings, where elites took in surplus from many households and sent part of it back out in food, drink, and small prestige items. Archaeologists see hints of this in large communal structures and feasting debris near elite areas. Marriage and alliance tie it together, elites intermarrying across communities, gifts of jade circulating as bride wealth or tokens sealing agreements, each transfer strengthening a chain leading back to the core city and its mound-top dead. And behind all of this sits the quiet possibility of force. Clear-cut weapons rarely turn up in Liangzhu tombs set aside as unambiguous swords, but polished stone axes and blades are common, and not all of them are purely symbolic. Walls and palisades around some settlements, signs of burning in certain layers, hints of trauma on some skeletons, all of it whispers that the social order wasn't maintained solely by consensus and good stories. What's just as telling is what we don't see. For every person buried under a mound with armfuls of jade, there were hundreds who ended up in small, unremarkable graves, or in places that haven't survived at all. We don't know their names, the jokes they told while transplanting rice seedlings, the songs they used to time the hauling of soil for the dikes, or what they thought as jade-laden elites passed by unraised causeways. Even the spectacular tombs are incomplete stories. Grave goods tell us how the living wanted to remember the dead, not necessarily what those people were like in life. So when we say Liangzhu was stratified, we are collapsing a messy lived reality into a blunt term. What we can say with confidence is that in this city of wetlands and walls, a small fraction of people had access to stunning quantities of jade and to the rituals that gave that jade meaning. Their deaths mobilized enormous labor and resources. Their tombs sit on higher ground, literally above other burials, sometimes above entire neighborhoods. The rest of the population built the dikes, tended the paddies, carried the stones, carved and polished and hauled, their fingerprints all over the jades, their own graves almost bare. Follow the jade, and the map changes. On a modern political map, Liangzhu sits in the lower Yangtze region, snug against the coast of eastern China. On a Liangzhu map, if they'd ever drawn one, it would look more like a spiderweb of rivers, lakes, tidal inlets, and low passes threading inland between mountain blocks. Because jade doesn't float, the most likely sources for Liangzhu's fine, greenish-white nephrite lie far from the rice fields and canals of the Taihu Basin. Candidates include river-worn boulders and mountain deposits to the west and northwest, in what's now Anhui, or further along the Yangtze corridors. Exact quarry sites are still debated, but one thing is clear, that stone had a journey. We find Liangzhu style Bai and Song, close cousins in proportion and polish, scattered across a broad swath of eastern China. Not just in the core city, but in smaller settlements along the lower Yangtze, in coastal sites edging what is now Shanghai, in inland communities up tributary rivers, even in regions dominated by other cultures, where a stray disc or tsong-shaped tube turns up looking suspiciously Liangzhu in proportion and finish. Those out-of-place pieces are echoes, proof that Liangzhu wasn't a solitary wetland experiment, but plugged into a wider Neolithic world. Archaeologists talk about a Liangzhu cultural sphere partly because of these spreads. Within it, recurring patterns show up, similar house forms, comparable pottery shapes, shared motifs on ritual objects. Outside it, contemporary communities like those of the Daanku or Kujiling traditions have their own distinct styles, but even they sometimes show hints of borrowing. A pot lip more common in the lower Yangtze turning up hundreds of kilometers away, a burial including a single tsong while the rest of the grave goods match a different local toolkit, a jade pendant drilled and polished with Liangzhu-level finesse in a region where jade working is otherwise much cruder. None of this proves a unified state or a top-down empire, but it strongly hints at regional connections, people traveling, visiting, marrying, trading, copying. The jade itself helps narrow down how those connections might have worked. Nephrite isn't evenly distributed, and the particular chemical fingerprints of some Liangzhu jade suggest relatively consistent sources over generations, implying some degree of controlled access. Either Liangzhu elites sent their own people upriver to gather stone from favored spots, or they maintained stable relationships with inland communities who did the extraction. Either way, the path from mountain boulder to polished tsong in an elite tomb had multiple stops. Raw blocks might be roughed out near the source, then shipped downriver as preforms. Some villages could have specialized in early-stage cutting and drilling. Bigger centers ran finishing workshops turning generic blanks into objects with the precise dimensions and motifs recognizable as Liangzhu style. Every step of that chain was an opportunity for contact. Boat crews weren't just hauling rock, they were carrying stories, gossip, new techniques, new songs. When you line up Liangzhu against its neighbors, the picture sharpens. The Daanku culture in Shandong to the north was also experimenting with jade, elaborate burials, and social hierarchy, though with different forms, more emphasis on earrings, different drilling techniques. With overlaps in how jade clustered in the graves of a few individuals. In the Kujiling and Shijia areas to the west, impressive earthworks, sophisticated pottery, and their own ritual objects appear. Along parts of the southeast coast, Neolithic fisher-farmer groups worked shell ornaments and simple jade. Liangzhu doesn't look like a copy of any of these, but it doesn't look oblivious to them either. The shared theme. Burying elites with hard-to-make prestige objects that encode cosmology pops up again and again, tweaked to local taste, suggesting ideas flowed as much as goods. How do you move ideas in a world without writing, wheels, or horses? Marriage is one of the most powerful mechanisms we know of. Even in small-scale societies today, marriages routinely cross community lines, and with them travel personal ornaments, bits of ritual knowledge, ways of speaking. If a Liangzhu lineage wanted to cement an alliance with a powerful family upriver, or a coastal group controlling a crucial fishing ground, sending a bride or groom with a few jade pieces as part of the bride wealth or dowry would have been a logical move, jades that then become foreign markers in a local graveyard generations later, silent evidence that someone's grandmother once came from downriver or over the mountains. Ritual gatherings are another likely vector. Agricultural cycles create built-in downtime and shared concerns, the flood season, the harvest, the turning of the year, perfect excuses to convene large groups. Liangzhu's monumental platforms and broad open spaces look tailor-made for periodic festivals. Boats converging on the city from scattered villages, people arriving with grain, reeds, prized shells or feathers not available locally. At those gatherings, rituals centered on Bai and Song could have been performed in full public view. Visiting leaders watched, learned, perhaps received a small jade as a token of participation, then returned home and adapted what they'd seen to their own traditions. Over time this process produces a patchwork of regional rites, similar structures, different local flavors, the shared Liangzhu look of certain objects reflecting something like a ritual franchise system, where central elites maintain prestige by being recognized as keepers of the right style. Contact of this sort tends to bring prosperity. A village allied to Liangzhu might gain access to better tools, or find its own products, salt, timber, fish, stone, suddenly in demand, with local leaders positioning themselves as gatekeepers to Liangzhu-linked supply chains, gaining leverage at home. But there's a flip side. Networks also spread risk and tension. If jade is the key to ritual legitimacy, and only certain groups can get the real thing through Liangzhu-linked supply chains, communities on the margins might feel pressure to break in, or to challenge the system with their own sacred stones. Competition over trade routes can create friction. A settlement controlling a narrow river bend or a low pass between watersheds can tax traffic, block access, or play rival centers off each other. Archaeological hints of palisades, burnt layers, and shifts in settlement patterns across the broader region suggest that cooperation and conflict were probably closely intertwined. So when we talk about Liangzhu influencing its neighbors, we're not talking about peaceful diffusion on one side and conquest on the other. We're talking about a dense mesh of kinship ties, ritual obligations, gift exchanges, rivalries, and negotiations stretching across river basins and coastal lagoons. A world where a jade buy from a wetland city might end up as the most treasured object in a mountain hamlet's shrine, even as that hamlet quietly wondered why it should keep honoring distant people it had never seen. The first strange thing about Liangzhu is the name itself. It isn't theirs. Liangzhu is the name of a modern village near the first major site that defined this culture, a type site, in archaeological jargon. When excavations there in the mid-20th century turned up a distinctive package of jades, pottery, house foundations, and earthworks, scholars needed a label, so they reached for the nearby place name, the same way Maya comes from a later colonial town or Harappa from one excavated mound in the industry somewhere between 5 and 4,000 years ago. The people who dug those canals and carved those jade stone almost certainly called themselves something. They had words for their town, their river, their ancestors, their enemies. We just don't know any of them. Unlike later dynasties, Liangzhu hasn't left us a clear written voice. No clay tablets covered in signs, no bamboo slips in waterlogged pits, no carved stone monuments announcing the deeds of kings. There are a few marks that tempt us. Some jade stone and pottery vessels bear incised symbols, short sequences of lines and shapes, often repeated, that look tantalizingly like proto-writing. A few scholars have argued these might be clan marks, ownership signs, or even an embryonic form of characters that later evolved into Chinese script. But they're brief, they don't run in long sequences, they don't obviously record sentences. Most researchers stop short of calling this writing in the full sense. It's more like a shared graphic vocabulary, meaningful for people in the know, opaque to us, not clearly phonetic or grammatical. It's also possible that more explicit writing existed but on materials that rarely survive. Symbols scratched into bamboo, painted on wood, inked onto woven cloth create records with a shelf life measured in years, not millennia, especially in a warm, wet delta that routinely floods. Even baked clay tablets can erode in unstable soils. We're stuck with a sample that's both tiny and heavily biased toward stone and fired earth. That silence has consequences. Without long texts, we don't know what Liangzhu people called their rulers, how they organized their lineages, what stories they told about the floods they clearly feared and engineered against. We can't hear their arguments, their prayers, their jokes. And because later written traditions in this region only really get going 1,000 years or more after Liangzhu's apparent end, there's no obvious historical memory to plug into. Early Chinese texts. The oracle bone inscriptions of the late Shang, the transmitted classics compiled in the Zhou and later periods, do contain lists of ancient peoples and shadowy polities, tribes along the eastern seas, states in the lower Yangtze, names like Yu and Wu and others more obscure. It's tempting to point to those and say this must be Liangzhu remembered under another label. But the timelines don't quite line up. By the time those texts were written, whole cycles of cultural change had rolled through the lower Yangtze, new ceramics, new burial customs, new settlement patterns. Liangzhu's great platforms were already old ruins, if visible at all. Historical traditions are also messy. They fold different groups together, downgrade enemies to barbarians, elevate allies into noble ancestors, and names shift, expand, and contract over time. If any distant echo of Liangzhu survived in oral traditions that eventually filtered into later texts, it has been thoroughly blurred, spliced, and renamed. Without texts, identity has to be reconstructed from other things. From the way houses are laid out in neat rows along raised causeways, from the consistent forms of pottery, thin dark burnished jars with certain rims that show up again and again in the same river basins, from the shapes and finishing techniques of jade and stone that follow strict proportions as if guided by rules everyone understood but nobody wrote down for us. Think of these as a kind of material accent. Liangzhu sounds like something in the archaeological record, even if we can't hear the actual words. The combination of wetland engineering, rice agriculture, and jade-saturated ritual practice forms a recognizable package, a cultural fingerprint. Ritual gives further clues: the clustering of jade in certain graves, the pairing of bai and tsong, the way altars and platforms sit in relation to water control features. Patterns that hint at shared cosmology, even if different villages along the canals argued about which lineage owned which stretch of paddy. When it came to burying their elite dead with specific jade sets and orienting the tombs just so, they were clearly drawing from the same rule book. Infrastructure is another axis of identity. Maintaining dikes, levees, and canal gates year after year requires different communities to coordinate. Someone deciding who brings how many people for repair work, who gets first access to drained fields, who has authority to close a gate in flood season even if it drowns one hamlet to save another. The large, integrated waterworks across the Liangzhu core suggest more than a loose cluster of unrelated villages. They suggest some form of regional framework, held together by shared investment in that engineered landscape. So even without a name, we can point to a pattern of life, a set of choices repeated over generations. That's identity, too. Then comes the hardest part, ending the story. When archaeologists peel back the layers at Liangzhu sites, they see something that doesn't quite fit our usual narratives. In some core areas, the shift is abrupt. Above levels packed with fine jades, polished black pottery, and evidence of intensive rice cultivation, you suddenly hit flood deposits, thick slabs of sterile clay, silt, and sand dumped by high-energy water, and on top of that, simpler occupations or sometimes nothing at all for a long stretch. In other places across the wider sphere, the picture looks more gradual. Jade becomes rarer, pottery styles change, settlement patterns shift toward higher ground, some practices bleed into later cultures, altered but not entirely gone. That tension has sparked one of the big debates in Neolithic East Asian archaeology. Was Liangzhu wiped out quickly by catastrophic flooding and climatic shifts, its core population displaced or destroyed while fragments of its culture drifted on elsewhere? Or are we mainly seeing the slow transformation of a system under pressure? Water management failures, social upheaval, trade realignment, where elites lose their grip, ritual loses its jade, and new configurations emerge without a single dramatic fall. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a landscape already stressed by social and environmental strain, then hit by a series of extreme floods that made the old wetland city model untenable. What we can say with some confidence is this. Whatever they called themselves, the people who built Liangzhu's jade-laced, water-bound world did not get to leave a clear signature in the historical record. Their name vanished. Their voice went quiet. Later civilizations rose over a landscape their canals had already reshaped. If you want to know how a story ends when no one bothered to write the last chapter, you read the binding. For Liangzhu, that binding is sediment. There's a recurring sequence that makes archaeologists sit up. You're digging through layers that scream high organization, dense house foundations, neatly laid floors, hearths, storage pits, post holes lined up as if someone had used a measuring cord. Concentrations of rice phytoliths and husk impressions point to intensive processing. The full ritual kit of bai, tsong, and plaques appears in carefully arranged graves. Then, without any neat transitional buffer, the texture changes. Instead of trampled living surfaces, you hit thick, structureless bands of clay and silt, often with coarse sand lenses and occasional rounded pebbles. No post holes, no hearths, no pottery in primary position, just water-laid material dumped fast, without regard for whatever was underneath it. In some areas around the big platforms and elite cemeteries, you even get multiple flood packages stacked like a grim layer cake: occupation, flood, brief reoccupation, flood again, each pulse blurring the old ground plan a little more until the original architecture is effectively entombed under alluvium. But sediment alone doesn't tell you whether you're looking at sudden collapse, organized retreat, or a long, reluctant migration inland. So archaeologists hunt for patterns above and around those muddy lines. One clue is what's missing. Above certain flood horizons in the core, the signature Liangzhu package thins or disappears. The black, highly polished pottery stops showing up in quantity. The spectacular, high-labor jades are gone. People might still use the area at later dates: a few scattered pits, rougher ceramics, traces of small-scale activity. But it isn't a continuation of the old wetland capital in slightly muddier form. The density drops, the complexity drops, the material accent changes. At the same time, more sites appear on slightly higher ground at the edges of the old heartland and in adjoining basins, smaller, less monumental, with toned-down ritual equipment. This is where material culture becomes a diagnostic tool. If a society collapses in place, elites overthrown, infrastructure neglected, population drastically reduced, you often see a sharp drop in craft specialization and status display right on top of the old center. People still live there, but stop doing the expensive, coordinated things that made the place look like a capital. If people migrate voluntarily or under duress, their habits tend to pop up somewhere else. The same house plans, the same ways of making pots, the same styles of ornament, perhaps in cheaper materials at first, the signature moving to a different stage. If what's happening is more like a cultural transition, with new groups blending with old ideas over time, the changes tend to be more uneven, some practices lingering for generations, others vanishing quickly, a mosaic replacing a clear, coherent pattern. Liangzhu's end shows pieces of all three. In some core zones, the combination of abrupt flood deposits, sharp breaks in building continuity, and the absence of any organized reoccupation looks like people being forced out, or choosing not to come back. That smells like partial collapse of the old system, at least locally. But in surrounding regions, especially on safer elevations, certain Liangzhu habits seem to smolder on. The fierce jade hierarchy, for example, fades rather than snaps. Later levels and neighboring cultural phases still show bai-like and song-like objects, but fewer per grave, smaller, cruder in finish, sometimes in other stones or imitative materials, as if the idea of those forms outlasted the ability or willingness to sink massive resources into them. Burial architecture changes too. Deep, carefully constructed chambered tombs give way in many areas to shallower pits with simpler offerings, orientation rules loosen, the strict pairings and quantities of classic Liangzhu cemeteries blur into more varied, less regimented arrangements. That doesn't suggest everyone died at once, it sounds more like elites losing their grip, ritual being renegotiated, old symbols repurposed or cut down to fit new economic realities. Pottery tells a quieter story of its own. Decorative motifs shift, once standard vessel shapes become rare, new forms appear linking more closely to later Neolithic and early Bronze Age cultures further up the Yangtze and along the coast, and paste recipes and firing techniques evolve. To a ceramic specialist, those changes are like dialect drift. You can almost hear the accent sliding towards something else. Here's the crucial complication: none of this is globally synchronized. One site might show a brutal flood package dated to roughly 4,300 years ago, with a stark drop in occupation afterward. Another, even within the broader Liangzhu sphere, might continue with fairly Liangzhu-like material for a few centuries beyond that, just in smaller, more dispersed communities. Yet another might show early adoption of new pottery styles and burial customs while still using elements of the old jade repertoire. That asynchrony matters. It suggests we're not dealing with a single day of doom, a one-and-done deluge that erased an entire civilization in a single season. Instead, the archaeological record points to a staggered unwinding, some places hammered early and hard, others adapting for a while, some experiencing multiple rounds of stress, flood, recovery, and reorganization before finally tipping into a new configuration. So when researchers try to explain what happened to Liangzhu, they're weighing several overlapping processes at once: environmental shock, especially flooding and hydrological shifts that undermine the wetland city model, economic and political strain, the breakdown of centralized coordination, loss of labor for maintaining the waterworks, changing trade routes that could starve elites of prestige goods, demographic change, people dying, moving away, or being absorbed into other communities. And cultural transformation, rituals and symbols morphing into new forms that no longer look Liangzhu in the strict sense, even if they carry some of its DNA. The layers in the ground don't pick one option for us. They just show where something changed, and how fast. If you're going to build your entire civilization around water, you're also marrying the mood swings of the sky. Liangzhu sat in the middle of a monsoon machine. Every year the East Asian summer monsoon hauled warm, wet air north from the tropics, and when that air hit cooler land it dumped rain, sometimes gently, sometimes with the energy of a stalled freight train. Over decades and centuries, that monsoon doesn't behave like a metronome. It pulses. Climate scientists looking at the broader region see signs of shifts around the right time window, periods when the monsoon seems to have intensified, bringing heavier, more concentrated rains, and other stretches when it weakened or failed, nudging landscapes toward drought. For a rice and wetland society, both ends of that swing are dangerous. Too weak, and the paddy system starts to crack. Channels silt up because there simply isn't enough flow to scour them naturally, yields drop, farmers fight over which fields get priority water, and elites who promised plenty suddenly look less capable. Too strong, and the whole low-lying plain turns into a temporary inland sea. You can see hints of extreme years locked into the sediments. In some cores, above the tidy occupation layers and engineered surfaces, there are thick, homogeneous flood deposits that don't look like the normal seasonal overbanking you'd expect in a wetland. They look like events where the entire hydrological regime crossed a threshold. The Liangzhu engineers clearly expected water to misbehave. They built levees, diversion ditches, reservoirs, and a network of raised causeways. They terraced platforms so the most important buildings and tombs sat above ordinary flood levels. They were not naive. But there's a limit to how much control you can impose on a delta. Picture a year, or a decade, when the summer monsoon stalls over the lower Yangtze, dropping rainstorm after rainstorm onto hills already saturated. Tributaries spike, the main channels swell, the carefully managed lake cushioning the city fills to the brim and keeps rising. Earthen embankments that held firm against ordinary floods start to seep, slump, and finally fail. Once that happens, control doesn't just ratchet down a notch, it can snap. A levee breach in a flat alluvial plain doesn't neatly wash through and go away. Water fans out, slows, and spreads, dropping its load of silt and sand exactly where you least want it, on fields and in streets. Channels clog. Paddies that needed a few centimeters of standing water sit under a meter of turbid soup. Houses designed for periodic wet feet find themselves waist-deep for weeks. You get the kind of blanketing clay and silt layers described earlier, fast, structureless accumulation suffocating whatever human order lay underneath. That's the catastrophic end of the spectrum. But there's also the slow squeeze. Sea level in this region has never been fixed. After the last ice age, global seas rose, and the rate of change shifted with regional wrinkles caused by tectonics and sediment loading. Rivers, including those feeding the Liangzhu lowlands, responded by meandering, suddenly jumping to new courses, building up or eroding away their own levees. For a civilization perched right where river meets sea, gradual shifts like these translate into moving goalposts. A channel that used to drain well begins to back up because the downstream base level is higher. Tidal influence creeps farther inland, changing salinity patterns. Areas once perfect for freshwater rice edge toward brackish marsh. Even without a single megaflood, that kind of background change chips away at the reliability of the rice economy. Fields that carried families for generations start failing more often. More labor has to be thrown at dredging, levee raising, and drainage just to maintain the status quo. Marginal land at the wet edges slips below the line of profitability. To test these ideas, archaeologists don't just point at a mud layer and call it a flood. They pull long, narrow cores out of lake beds, abandoned channels, and low basins around the old city and read them like climate diaries. Grain size is one clue. Coarse sands and gravels indicate high-energy events, big floods chewing through banks and dumping heavy material, while fine clays and silt settling slowly indicate calmer periods. X-ray and geochemical scans reveal abrupt changes in composition that can signal sudden inputs of river water versus more stable lake conditions. Pollen grains, preserved like microscopic fossils, tell you what was growing nearby. Layers rich in rice pollen and human-favored plants hint at active agriculture, while shifts toward wild wetland species or plants that like disturbed, salty, or standing water can mark times when fields went out of cultivation. Diatoms, single-celled algae whose shells are highly sensitive to salinity and water depth, offer another line of evidence. A flip from forms that prefer shallow, fresh paddies to ones that thrive in deeper, more turbid or brackish water is a strong sign that the aquatic environment changed under people's feet. When dozens of these cores from different spots are lined up and dated, patterns emerge. Around the time Liangzhu's material record thins and those big flood packages appear, many cores show signs of unusually intense flooding and a more unstable monsoon. It's not unanimous, local factors matter. But there's enough convergence that climate stress and hydrological chaos looks very plausible as a major player. Yet even here, environment doesn't get to be the lone villain. The same rainfall hitting a landscape with freshly maintained levees, clear channels, and a surplus of coordinated labor is not the same as that rainfall hitting a system already frayed by politics, overextension, or neglect. Mud layers don't record how many workers turned up for repair duty, or whether ruling families diverted labor to ever fancier jade tombs instead of raising embankments. They don't record whether factional infighting delayed decisions until it was too late, or whether refugees from earlier floods upstream were already straining food supplies. Environmental pressure and human decision-making are braided together. A rising water table is a problem. A rising water table combined with elites who can no longer command enough trust or muscle to rebuild the dikes is a catastrophe. The wetland that had once been Liangzhu's superpower became a trap. The same low, rich, easily irrigated land that let them build a jade-studded capital also left them exquisitely vulnerable when the monsoon shifted and the rivers turned against them. But climate and water only set the stage. Whether the actors froze, fled, or fought was another matter entirely. Power in a place like Liangzhu wasn't just about who sat on the tallest platform. It was about who could make thousands of people move in the same direction, at the same time, year after year. And that's where inequality comes back into the frame. Those jade bionts didn't carve themselves. The terraces, dams, and causeways didn't emerge from spontaneous community spirit. They were the product of command. Someone deciding where the canal would run, whose fields would be sacrificed for the reservoir, who got extra rice in a bad year, and who went hungry. At first, that kind of inequality can feel like a fair trade. You give a priest-king your labor, your surplus grain, your son for the work crew, and in return the fields stay watered, the floods are tamed, the ancestors remain on your side. The jade on the hill is proof the spirits are listening. But when the system starts to falter, inequality doesn't stay abstract. It becomes personal. Imagine a stretch of bad monsoons. Some levees fail, some don't. Some communities get prompt repairs, others wait. The storehouses in the core city still seem to have grain, while outlying hamlets are scraping the bottom of every basket. You don't need written records to see how that would play out. One telltale sign of rising tension in the archaeological record is divergence. Rich tombs staying rich even as the average burial thins out, elite compounds staying maintained while more modest structures are abandoned or rebuilt in cheaper, hastier fashion, workshops near the center still turning out high-quality jade even as outer zones show less craft specialization. At Liangzhu we do see that kind of sharp hierarchy, baked into the system long before the end. What we don't have, at least not yet, are smoking guns of armed conflict. A collapse in a blaze of warfare would leave specific traces, mass graves with clear trauma, skulls cracked by blows, ribs pierced by projectiles, defensive works hastily reinforced, ditches redug and deepened, palisade lines rebuilt over and over, burn layers across key structures, not accidental hearth fires but widespread, synchronized destruction. So far those hallmarks are thin on the ground. There are occasional hints of interpersonal violence, as you'd expect in any dense society, but not the sustained pattern of warfare seen in some later Bronze Age cities. That doesn't mean conflict wasn't there, it might have worn a different face. Think about water as a political weapon. If you control the gates on the main canal, you don't need an army to hurt your enemies. You can simply let repairs on their side of the basin be delayed. You can release water at the wrong time, sabotaging a planting season. You can prioritize the paddies that send grain to your own warehouses over those feeding a rival lineage. None of that leaves the same kind of archaeological signature as a burned fort. It leaves patchy fields, frustrated farmers, and whispered grievances against the people in charge of the sluice. Now layer factional politics on top. Liangzhu almost certainly wasn't a simple, single house forever. As lineages expanded and new elite families rose on the back of successful trade or control of certain rituals, competition over who got to speak for the ancestors, who got the prime burial plots, who controlled the flow of prestige jade, would be expected. In that kind of environment, every failed harvest, every flood, every ruined paddy becomes ammunition. One faction blames another for diverting labor to an extravagant tomb project instead of rebuilding embankments. Someone points to a breach in the canal as proof the spirits have been offended. A junior branch of the ruling clan promises it could manage the water better, if only people would shift their loyalty. On the ground, this plays out as coordination failure. The brilliance of Liangzhu's water system lay in its integration: dams upstream buffering flows, canals distributing water across a broad plain, fields, causeways, and settlement platforms all interacting with the same controlled hydrology. But that integration has a dark side. It depends on everyone playing their assigned part. If one jurisdiction holds back on maintenance because it's overtaxed, angry, or trying to leverage a better deal, the costs don't stop at its border. Sediment builds up, flows redirect, weak points appear downriver. Technically the fix is obvious: repair the weak points, increase collective labor, redig the channels. Politically, that means extracting resources from people who are already stressed and may no longer believe the center can deliver. When that trust cracks, infrastructure flips from asset to liability. A wall everyone maintains is protection; a wall only some people maintain starts to funnel disaster toward those left out. A canal dredged on schedule brings life. A canal silted up on one side of a factional boundary sends unexpected flood pulses to the other. From the outside, centuries later, we just see the end state: channels abandoned, dams breached or buried, occupation layers petering out. But behind that physical decay could be a long story of political paralysis, meetings that went nowhere, rituals that failed to convince leaders who could no longer command the bodies needed to keep the water machine humming. In that context, elite replacement doesn't have to mean palace coups with knives in the dark. It could look like people voting with their feet. An up-and-coming faction in some neighboring upland, or along a different branch of the river, offers a simpler deal: move here, work these fields, take part in our rituals, no giant embankments to maintain, no flooded capital to bail out, maybe fewer jade ornaments but more predictable yields. Over a generation or two, key specialists, craftspeople, ritual experts, managers, start marrying into those other communities. Some of the ritual symbols of Liangzhu travel with them: specific forms of bai and song, patterns of burial, ways of organizing fields. At the core site, fewer hands show up for dredging duty, fewer sons are willing to be buried on the great platform under heaps of jade that no longer guarantee anything. The ruling line looks around and realizes that the city which once anchored the entire region is hollowing out from the inside. From an archaeological perspective, this can look strangely gentle: no charred destruction, no layers of smashed bone, just fewer and fewer signs of life, then none. The center goes quiet while surrounding areas show continuity in tools, farming, and sometimes ritual items, just under new roofs and new local names. That's cultural absorption. Instead of a civilization dying in place, it dissolves into the cultures around it, like ink dispersing into water. The Liangzhu way of managing rice, building platforms, carving jade, and perhaps even thinking about the cosmos doesn't vanish, it gets folded into whatever comes next, into the early cultures that later Chinese traditions will look back on and mythologize without knowing exactly who did what, where. To us, centuries and millennia later, that looks like disappearance. One moment, dense jade burials and big earthworks, the next, a quieter landscape, new ceramics, different settlement patterns. It's tempting to draw a thick line and declare this the end of the Liangzhu civilization. But on the ground, for the people living through it, the story was probably less about endings and more about renegotiation, new leaders, new centers, old ideas remixed under different skies. The Jade cities didn't crumble into nothing. Their power structures proved fragile, their rituals lost their monopoly, their capital lost its pull. Yet their descendants, and their cultural DNA, kept walking, planting, carving, and praying in the same river valleys. Zoom out from the drama of collapse and ask a quieter question: what actually survived? The picture gets more subtle, and more interesting. Because even without names, without chronicles, without a single intact scroll, Liangzhu does not feel like a complete dead end. It feels like a foundation later builders paved over, brick by brick, without ever knowing whose house they were standing on. Take Jade. Thousands of years after Liangzhu's dams silted up, later dynasties were still obsessing over it. Philosophers wrote that a gentleman compares his virtue to jade. Ritual manuals laid out which kinds of jade discs belong in which ceremonies. Jade by faded into obscurity as tokens of heaven, jade song faded into obscurity too. But the idea that carved stone can bridge human and cosmic order never really goes away. Is that a straight line from Liangzhu to Zhou ritual texts? No. Too much time, too many missing layers. But when very similar forms, flat discs and columnar tubes with cornered exteriors, reappear in later Neolithic and early Bronze Age cultures to the north and west, it's hard not to suspect a shared inheritance. Maybe not a conscious memory of Liangzhu as a place, but a memory embedded in practice. This is how you mark a sacred boundary, this is what a serious burial looks like, jades reserved for the few, used to stage a relationship between the living, the dead, and the sky. Chinese tradition later turned jade into a moral technology, something that disciplines the self, represents purity, stands between the ruler and the chaos outside. Liangzhu's jade was doing something similar long before anyone wrote those ideas down. Whether that's direct descent or convergent thinking on the same material, it's one of the clearest ways the wetland kingdom still whispers in later ritual. But the mystery pushes back in the gap between the last flourishing Liangzhu platforms and the earliest clearly documented dynastic states. There are gaps, regional cultures that rise and fall, shifts in pottery styles, changes in settlement patterns. Archaeologists give them modern names: Guangfulan, Qianshanyang, Maqiao. None of them come with a label saying, former Liangzhu people, now relocated. We don't know what the Liangzhu called themselves, what their neighbors called them, or which later legendary groups, if any, preserve a warped folk memory of jade cities in the southern wetlands. That silence is part physical, part historical. Wetland sites rot. Wooden tablets, fiber, bark, all the cheap, everyday materials that would have carried accounts or short notes, disappear in mud and bacteria. Whatever oral traditions survived the dispersal of Liangzhu's people were filtered, edited, and overwritten by centralizing states that emerged hundreds or thousands of years later. So scholars argue. Some see deep continuity. Rice agriculture, water management, and jade ritual radiating north over centuries, slowly crystallizing into the ritual systems eventually codified in Zhou and early imperial texts. Others are more cautious, pointing to abrupt changes, regional breaks, and the sheer weight of time between roughly 2300 BCE and the first solid historical inscriptions. Into that fog step new tools. Remote sensing is beginning to pick out faint traces of canals, levees, and platforms under modern fields, hinting that Liangzhu wasn't a single city but part of a more expansive engineered landscape than previously realized. As those patterns emerge, researchers can start asking whether later sites reuse the same alignments, the same hydrological logic. Refined dating, high-precision radiocarbon combined with Bayesian modeling, is tightening the timelines, moving from broad windows of sometime in these 3 centuries to sharper pictures of which regions lit up just as Liangzhu dimmed, and which communities may have overlapped for a human lifetime or two. Residue studies on pottery and tools reveal more about what people actually cooked, fermented, and stored, and whether certain vessel shapes stayed tied to rice or shifted to other grains in successor cultures. Tracing not just people on the move, but habits on the move. And in a few lucky cases, ancient DNA is coming into play. Rice genomes can show lines of descent, which strains were domesticated where and how they spread. Human remains, when preservation cooperates and ethical frameworks allow, can sometimes reveal population continuity or replacement. Did the people in a later site near Liangzhu share ancestry with the earlier wetland inhabitants, or were they newcomers adopting an abandoned landscape? None of this delivers a neat origin story. It just sharpens the outlines of what we can and can't say. What we know, by the time bronze-wielding states were building walled cities in the Central Plains and writing the earliest Chinese characters, there was already a long tradition in eastern China of managing water, growing rice at scale, and using jade to stage power and cosmology. Liangzhu is one of the clearest, earliest, and most spectacular expressions of that tradition. What we suspect. That ideas born in those jade cities, about how to link political authority to control of water, how to fuse ancestor worship with social hierarchy, how to materialize heaven and earth in a piece of stone, did not vanish with the last flood. They were carried, reinterpreted, and eventually folded into the fabric of what later generations would call Chinese civilization, even if they had forgotten the specific mouths that first spoke them. What we don't yet know are the pathways, the middle stories, the names of the people who kept a few Liangzhu patterns alive in some smaller valley while new centers rose elsewhere, and the precise degree to which later jade rites are remembering versus reinventing. What remains certain is this. Somewhere in eastern China, 5,000 years ago, a people without metal, without writing, without the wheel, built a walled city on a floodplain, tamed a monsoon delta with dams and canals that still draw the admiration of modern engineers, turned swamp into surplus and surplus into jade, and staged, in stone circles and squares, a claim about the order of heaven and earth. Then, over a span that felt to them like generations but reads to us like an instant, the water they had learned to command turned unpredictable again, the coordination that held their world together frayed, and the city they built was folded back into the mud. Their name did not survive. Their voice did not survive. But the shape of what they believed, carved into the hardest stone they could find, still waits in the ground for anyone patient enough to read it.